Okay, we're continuing on with part 2 of the 6.11 lesson, and we were on page 457, and the second paragraph, or first full paragraph actually. The Democrats captured several southern state governments, in some cases by using violence to intimidate Republican voters and keep African Americans away from the polls. In many southern states, white militias formed to overturn local election results and reinstitute white rule. Since federal troops were gradually withdrawing from the South, there was little that local Republicans could do to stop the violence. In Mississippi, Governor Adelbert Ames, a carpetbagger and former Union general, predicted that white violence would soon destroy most of the hard-fought gains of the Civil War and result in an era of second slavery. Despite Grant's plea to let us have peace, the divisions in American politics were as bitter as ever. Republicans, increasingly allied with big businesses and big government, squared off against Democrats, who appealed to the urban working class, and in the South, poor white farmers and those opposed to racial equality. The Compromise of 1877. In the 1876 presidential election, the Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes, who was, like Grant, a former Civil War general. The Democratic candidate was Samuel J. Tilden, who campaigned against the incapacity, waste, and fraud of the federal government and the carpetbag tyrannies the Republicans had imposed in the South. And here's a map of military districts during Reconstruction. The election suffered from corruption on both sides. At first, Tilden seemed to have more votes. Then Hayes was declared the winner. Democrats accused Republicans of massive vote fraud. Republicans accused Democrats of voter intimidation. Congress appointed a commission to investigate the disputed results of the election. Behind the scenes, Republican and Democratic leaders worked out a deal known as the Compromise of 1877. Democrats agreed to accept Hayes' victory in exchange for the removal of all federal troops from the few southern states in which they remained. The withdrawal of federal troops would leave Southerners free to govern themselves, which is basically signaling the end of Reconstruction. Hayes was inaugurated in March of 1877. Some Democrats continued to insist he had stolen the presidency and ridiculed him as an old Rutherford and his fraudulency. But Hayes stayed true to the deal his party had struck. He appointed cabinet officials known for their hostility to Reconstruction. He ordered a withdrawal of the remaining federal troops from the South. His actions made it clear that the federal government would no longer attempt to reshape Southern society or support African Americans in their struggle for civil rights. Within a few years, increased white violence and intimidation wiped out a decade of African American economic and political gain. Political power in the South shifted from Republicans to white Redeemer Democrats, as they call themselves, claiming they had saved the South from Republican dominance. Reconstruction effectively had come to an end. The mixed legacy of Reconstruction. Reconstruction left a mixed legacy. The rebellious states were successfully incorporated into the Union. The new Southern state constitutions, as well as the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, prompted an unprecedented experiment in interracial democracy. For a brief while, rights of American citizens millions of African Americans proudly claimed their rights as American citizens and created their own social, religious, and educational institutions. Yet the end of Reconstruction saw most Southern blacks with my eyes are playing tricks on me. Yet the end of Reconstruction saw most Southern blacks still stuck in poverty. With Democrats now in control of every Southern statehouse, white rule was reinstated. Over the coming decades, blacks in the South would lose most of the political and social rights they had gained, including their cherished right to vote. Looking back on Reconstruction, the African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois observed, "The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back to slavery again." And here's a political cartoon. This is a ballot box, and it says, in the 1876 presidential election, the ballot box became a political football. Disputes led to the Compromise of 1877. The Reconstruction Amendments. Okay, this last page of this lesson reading has the three amendments that we call the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution were often referred to as the Reconstruction Amendments. These amendments ended slavery and granted citizenship and its privileges, especially the vote, to former slaves who had been excluded when the Constitution was originally written. While assuring federal protection to these new citizens, the amendments could not prevent individual states from trying to get around the new laws, nor did they extend the vote to women. Some historian argues that the Reconstruction Amendments in expanding civil liberties transformed the Constitution and charged the federal government with a new role as a custodian of freedom, in the words of Charles Sumner, an abolitionist senator from Massachusetts. And those are the excerpts below from the Reconstruction Amendments. So the 13th Amendment, that's Roman numeral 13, that's abolishing slavery. Amendment 14, that's granting full citizenship to all citizens of the United States, not being based on race. And then the 15th Amendment gives African American men the right to vote. Okay, let's go back to the lesson now that we're done with the reading. So we should have looked through your reading guide if you were filling it out as we went along. Make sure you have that finished filling that out, or if you're just going along with the lesson answer key, either way, make sure you check your answers and that you have them correct by looking at the lesson answer key. The next thing is complete the analyzing cartoons activity, and then we have a graded assignment at the end. Okay, life in the Reconstruction South. While congressional support was strong for Reconstruction and the Union Army continued to occupy the South, former slaves experienced new civil and political rights. Economic success, however, eluded most African Americans, and racist whites across the South attempted to terrorize them and the Republican allies into submission. Okay, continuing on. Primary source analysis, analyzing political cartoons. Now, political cartoons, the word cartoon sometimes makes people think that they're going to be funny, but it's just a different type of drawing. Many political cartoons aren't necessarily like ha 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 rolling on the floor type laughter, but something that to make you think, to see a message or an event in a different way, and that's what these political cartoons that we're going to look at today are about. They're not like rolling on the floor laughing because they're hilarious comics, but they're making a political statement. And Thomas Nast was the political cartoonist that we for the cartoons we'll be looking at for today's lesson. He was a very prominent political cartoonist at the time, and many of his images are still reflected in many things today, including Santa Claus. He's credited with being having the first drawing of the jolly fat man in a red suit that many people identify with today. Okay, so analyzing political cartoons. Primary source analysis is the examination of a primary source for the purpose of better understanding a time period, event, or person. A primary source is information that was created at the time being studied by someone with direct personal knowledge of the event or events being described. Primary sources include handwritten, typed, or printed documents, images, statistics, and audio and video recordings. Political cartoons are one type of primary source. Many political cartoons were created during the Reconstruction period. Through analysis of these primary sources, you can better understand the events and people of this period in American history. There are some steps to analyze a political cartoon. First of all, take a look at it. Just get an overall impression. This one is called This is a White Man's Government by Thomas Nast, 1868. Then a trick you can do is draw it into 4 parts and then look at each quadrant to study that one particular quadrant very carefully to look for specific details. And then there are a series of questions that you should ask yourself as you're analyzing their cartoon, such as who created the cartoon and what do I know about that person? When was the cartoon created? What is the purpose of the cartoon? Who is the intended audience? And what is the tone of the work? You learned in the previous lesson that the Republican-controlled Congress passed the Freedmen's Bureau Bill to help former slaves make the transition to freedom. The bill was passed in February 1866, but was vetoed by President Johnson. The bill was passed and became law 5 months later when Congress overrode his veto. Analyze this political cartoon by Thomas Nast. Follow the instructions on the previous screen, these here, to begin your analysis. Okay, so this cartoon here, this isn't one of the ones for the assignment, but we're just going to use this as a practice. Okay, so it's called Andrew Johnson Kicking the Freedmen's Bureau by Thomas Nast, 1866. So we have to think back, what do we know about Andrew Johnson and his ideas and his feelings regarding the Freedmen's Bureau? And what can you tell just from the cartoon as well? Well, he's kicking the bureau, and a bureau is another name for a dresser, down the steps. Okay, so just by that alone, you can see that this is probably going to show something negative about President Johnson because they show him kicking something, and he has a sour expression on his face. Those are some things you can see here. If you look at the top of the photo, or the cartoon I mean, you see where it says the veto. And what do you remember about Johnson and the veto power and how that was controversial? And then you see people falling out of this dresser, and those are probably, and then it says there on the on the picture, which is pretty small writing, but it says freedom or freedmen. Probably I'd have to enlarge it to see it better, but so you know that that's referring to the Freedmen's Bureau. They're falling out, they're being crushed. So Johnson's veto of that is basically crushing any rights or any political or economic gains they might try to achieve because of his veto of the bill. Okay, here are the chapter highlights, and you can read through those on your own, but I wanted to go through a little bit more about the graded assignment because this is can be a challenging assignment trying to analyze the political cartoons. But let's first read a little bit about Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast was a caricaturist and cartoonist who created political cartoons during the second half of the 19th century. He showed a talent and passion for drawing at an early age and began drawing for Harper's Weekly, which is a popular newspaper/magazine, in 1859. He drew extensively during the Civil War, often depicting battlefields. After the war, Nast drew many cartoons that showed his opposition to President Johnson and his Reconstruction policies. So from reading that little bit about Thomas Nast, we know that he did not agree with many of the things that were happening. So when you see a cartoon like this, it's not showing that this is what Nast likes. It's not showing that he likes African Americans being trampled. It's showing that he is trying to tell people that this is a horrible thing, trying to raise awareness because he does not like what's going on. But let's look a little closer at the graded assignment itself. Alright, so on page 10 of this lesson, you'll see where it says we need to go to this site, Analyzing Political Cartoons, to learn a little bit more about our graded assignment. And our graded assignment is here. When I open that up, it's asking us to analyze one of the political cartoons in the Analyzing Political Cartoons gallery. And what that is the Political Cartoons gallery. This is it. So you have either this one of Andrew Johnson, President Johnson, and Uncle Sam, or you have this is a white man's government cartoon to choose from. Okay, so we have to look at our questions. And the questions are asking us to gauge your initial reaction to the cartoon. When was the cartoon drawn? And for both of them, you can just put Reconstruction. You don't have to have the specific year, but if you put down during Reconstruction, that's acceptable. What is the subject of the cartoon? What's it about? And here's the really important part, these 4 boxes. What did the cartoonist include in the cartoon? You list the people. What objects do you see in the cartoon? What event or action is taking place? And then what do some of the things, the objects and the people, symbolize in the cartoon? What do you think was our cartoonist's purpose in creating this work? Who do you think the intended audience was, and why do you think this is? What is the tone of the cartoon? Is it dark? Is it happy? Is it fun? Is it sad? And then based on your observations of this cartoon, what 3 things can you infer from it? So, for example, that's asking you, like, what are 3 things that you might know that's going on at the time based on what the messages you're getting from this cartoon? Or what are 3 things that you might think the cartoonist is trying to tell people about? That's what that question means. But now let's look at the cartoons themselves a little more closely. And I have a nice website here that really has a nice big image of the white man's government cartoon. I really like this one because I think it has a lot of meaning and imagery in it. And this website, it's blackhistory.harpersweek.com. You can just Google a white man's government. Just type that into Google, and this will be one of the first things that'll come up from Harper's Weekly. And this has a nice, wonderful summary of what the cartoon is about too. So that's a really great resource to check out. I don't usually say that you have to do outside research for graded assignments, but this one is just a great website and it really summarizes with the cartoon